Hey, all. I've spent the last weekish working on a production level MCP server for Sentry, and I want to talk a little bit about that. Primarily because Sentry's concerns are a big production B2B business. You know, for those of you who don't know us, we are north of 100 million in revenue. We've got something like 65,000 paid customers, so it's a very serious use case. And so I think about things a little bit differently than your hobbyist project or your fun little prototype and stuff. And in a week, I would argue that we've effectively deployed a production-capable service. Now, it's not super battle-tested, and there's some gotchas and stuff, but I'm going to talk through that, talk through the challenges of doing that, how we did it, what it looks like, and kind of what you should know. So first things first, I've got this repository here, Sentry MCP. It's on GitHub. You can Google it. You'll figure it out. I'm going to use this to show you everything. So let's start by booting up the dev server, which this is on Cloudflare. And so given that, it's booting up the Wrangler dev server, rather. I'm not an expert in Cloudflare, and there's a bunch of funky things in there, so just, take that for what it is. I will note, if you want to see this in prod, mcp.sentry.dev. But for the sake of this conversation, I'm just going to talk about the local server, also because maybe I'll avoid revealing any sensitive secrets or something like that. So, okay. So what you need to know is this little command at the top, or this configuration, rather, at the top. This is doing two things. One, it is sort of giving you the address of the MCP server sent event. SSE is server sent events. It's basically like WebSockets, but one way. It's giving you the address of that server. But more importantly, what it's doing is wrapping it in this MCP remote NPM package. And this is kind of the crux of the challenge today. This is very much alpha software. You are an early adopter. It's not going to work that well yet. But what this is doing is MCP now, as of I think a couple weeks ago, supports an authentication protocol, which is just OAuth, effectively enabling this for businesses like Sentry. And it's kind of my belief system that businesses like Sentry, this is going to be a very, very big deal, because it allows us to expose a really strong human language derivative of our RESTful APIs. And particularly with what I'm going to show you today, it just bolts on top of any existing OAuth provider, assuming your company already has one. And so we were fortunate. But MCP Remote wraps that right now. It basically says, we know nobody supports any of this, so here's a proxy that will run the OAuth on demand for you and then make this work as if it was sort of a local environment. Now, there are some problems with this, and I'm going to show you one right away. So let's take this, and we're going to stick it in a cursor. So you can ignore this terminal down here. Let's go in here. So click the settings at the top in cursor, go to MCP, click Add, put it in here, save. Now, as soon as you save, what's going to happen is it's going to show up here. And fortunately, this worked on the first try because a lot of times it fails, and it fails in very unpredictable ways. But when unfortunately I do not have the authentication, I'm not going to rehash or sort of throw away my auth tokens and stuff just to re-authenticate. It's not a big deal. But what would happen is if you were not authenticated, your browser would have a tab open that's going through the OAuth flow for you. That's being controlled by MCP Remote. And then the token will be persisted within MCP Remote. And so that's a normal OAuth flow. So it's bound to a single user token, all these things, right? I'll tell you what happens in practice is I'm going to go to, I need the output. So this is just the easiest way to get to the output. MCP, cursor MCP. What is actually happening, I think this is a bug in cursor temporarily, but it's actually running two of these processes. So normally what you're going to see, or at least what I've been seeing in cursor, is it's doubling up those auth flows and who knows who's winning and stuff. And just again, beta software, alpha software, it may or may not work correctly, but you're sort of future-proofing yourself by looking at MCP now, by getting this production ready. So, okay, we're authenticated. We've got a list of tools here, right? Mostly straightforward. I'll talk about all this. This box, enable and disable, it doesn't do that much. What it does, I believe, is just disables it from being referenced in the agent, but it doesn't disable network connections to it. And so say I have this disabled and my access token expires, which it will. You're gonna come back, and this happened to me the other night. You're gonna come back with like 50 OAuth tabs trying to prompt you to re-authenticate. So if you want to actually disable something, just go to edit and remove it from the thing for now. I'm sure Cursor will improve this. Refresh, similar sort of caveat. It's a little glitchy sometimes, partially because MCP Remote will sometimes hang on connections and not know that you say close the authentication window, and it'll time out after a period of time. And the timeout is actually like, I don't know what it is, but it seems very long. It seems on the order of minutes, not seconds, which you can imagine a minute for you to click the authorize button, but it's much longer than it should be. Anyway, so refresh may or may not do funny things. In this case, it seems to be working right now. We've got this remote up. Now, I've got all these tools available, so I can reference them. Just pretend you don't know what an MCP is. Maybe you don't. What organizations can I access in Sentry? Pretty straightforward. It should use the MCP. Now, again, it's a little flaky. It may or may not work. You're relying on the provider, but in this case, it did. Called this organizations. You can see what it's doing in here. No parameters, the raw output, and then it gave me that, right? Not very useful. What is useful is things like search for errors in the file or create a new project. And so these are how we think about workflows, and this is why you need something that's not a REST API, because you need to explain to the language model how to use your APIs in a way that works with these language models. So let's go back to the thing. When you're setting up a project, what I did is, I think it was, I don't know what this wacky URL is, but I got started based on this. And so you'll note this is 2 weeks ago. Cloudflare has built a bunch of functionality, and it's pretty early. These are not GA capable systems. Sorry, Cloudflare folks, I like you, but that's the truth. That allow you to actually quickly string this together, and that's what I did. And it is very quick. It's very, very, very good. All you really need to know here is they have an agents SDK, which fundamentally works with their workers and durable objects. And durable objects are just basically state for workers. I'm not going to try to explain them. It took me forever to wrap my head around it. I still don't know. I don't care. They're state for workers. And what's really important is this workers OAuth provider. So what this does is this implements the current gen spec of OAuth 2, wraps your OAuth provider, or I think it works with some third parties like WorkOS and whatnot, and then reissues an access token that's coupled to the local service. So it's not disclosing your upstream token. What I mean by that is this access I have here on the SSE it's an access token, but it's not the access token that Sentry issued. It's a new access token issued by the MCP server that is actually proxying back to Sentry's access token. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. Okay, so I followed this. What this looks like in practice, I'm just going to go through a few things. So I've got this repo here, and again, I'm trying to set you up for production. It's not a toy app. What that means is I need CI to work, to verify that things work. I need this to be stable in production. I need to have a monitoring in production, all these little things that you might not need in a toy project. I do not quite have all those things working to the degree I want yet, but I'm going to go through how the project looks, kind of what you need to get started, and I'll go through, frankly, the issue list that I've found that's still problematic. So the first thing to understand when you do this is you need that OAuth provider, either through a third party like a WorkOS, or you have your own, like Sentry has its own. So I create an application, I get a client ID and a client secret, right? In my thing, and I'm not going to pull mine up because I don't want to deal with leaking production secrets. I have this dev.vars file over here. You'll see it in the sidebar. I've got the Sentry client ID and the Sentry client secret made available to that, right? Makes sense. It's what you get from normal OAuth flow. This is no different than configuring normal OAuth. I'm not going to teach you that. Go figure it out. Beyond that, and what's more interesting is sort of the repository itself. So there are two things, or there's one fundamental thing to understand here. The MCP provider, even though it's a web service, is technically speaking separable, whatever you want to call it, from the OAuth provider. So you'll see this. This is Cloudflare's OAuth provider, and it's wrapping this app handler. This app handler is just a worker endpoint. Now, what this means is if you took this out and you just exported this, it's going to export a worker route that can just load on the web, like a normal thing, right? But that worker route's going to require a bearer token that it doesn't have access to. So all this is doing is kind of maintaining that flow, hijacking 401s, implementing the proxy and everything for you. Actually, implementing the whole thing, the proxy for the client and or the provider and client, and then passing that into the SSE or the service, the MCP, I should say rather. So it's mostly straightforward here. And you know, if you know who I am, you know I hate software these days, and particularly ignore. If you think my code sucks, I don't really give a shit. It probably does. I'm not trying for perfection. I'm trying for things you do to build businesses. And so I've got some scaffolding here. I've tried to structure the repo in a way that kind of makes sense, but I'm constantly moving things around, fighting with the compiler, whatever, right? Okay. So I've wrapped this within Sentry just to make sure we have some monitoring. I don't know if this is even working. We have a bunch of folks looking into the Cloudflare stuff right now to make sure everything's working correctly, but I will tell you, Sentry, we have some stuff we have to fix. Like, we're not actually getting data from the WebSocket or the socket. I'll just call it the socket because I don't want to say SSE over and over, but we're not actually getting data like traces from the socket. We're going to fix that pretty quickly. But generally speaking, I'm wrapping it with Sentry, so I have some production monitoring, so I know when it's broken and not, and I don't have to look at Cloudflare's logs. There's also a way to do this in Cloudflare. You can figure it out. But the main thing is this, right? So you would have this. You don't need this. This is really important. So unlike normal OAuth, this client registration thing, this is what allows Cursor to authenticate with this. And what I mean by that is when Cursor authenticates via MCP remote to this service, it's going to implicitly create a new OAuth client. That's a newer thing. I'm not super familiar with it. I think it's part of the 2.1 spec in OAuth 2, and I haven't implemented OAuth since 2.0 was a thing. But this is kind of how it works. And all I'm doing is I'm specifying these URLs. All right, Cursor. And I think this is just the same route as this. I don't know. But this is basically boilerplate. I would expect everybody's code to look the same here. Let's go into this because this is actually pretty important. So the default handler is the app. Now, I'm still figuring out what we all want to expose here, but I'm going to give you ours so far. So first off, I have a robots.txt because robots are really annoying these days. It's mostly like, hey, you can look at the homepage, figure out what's here, stop messing with anything else that exists. Straightforward. LLMs.txt. Don't take this as gospel. I just threw some stuff on here, so we had some boilerplate. What really matters is I have two endpoints here, right? I have this home handler, ignore Cursor's suggestion there, and this auth handler. Home handler, all it is this page. It's literally just rendering this HTML. Now, it's doing it in a way that's hypothetically useful, and I was inspired by some others' work I'll talk about when I get there to make this happen, but the reason this is not, say, just a .html page is because, well, beyond I'm dynamically constructing, say, the MCP configuration via the URL, I'm actually also dynamically generating the tool definitions here, self-documenting, right? And I really wanted this because I wanted you to be able to look at something at a glance and see what's going on. And that's obviously a really powerful thing. You know, this is just kind of strung together really fast, but that's what the home route is it's just this page, just that index page. It's not critical, but in my opinion, you should have something like this. Like you should have that landing page. Auth handler is kind of what you'd implement right away, and Cloudflare has a demo app that will have this for you. It's roughly the same as mine. I don't think I've changed anything. I've probably got some stuff like this in here that's like, there's a better way to do it, like exporting the type elsewhere. But generally speaking, all this is doing is defining these three things. The scopes I need to request from the upstream API, the auth URL, and the token URL. And I'm actually doing suffixes here because Sentry is open source-ish in the sense of like you can self-host it, and thus we allow you to override the URL in case you want to point it to a self-hosted instance rather. Anyways, this is all pretty straightforward. I'm not going to go through this because this is effectively one for one from the code, other than you kind of define some stuff here, and you're like, oh, I need a return from this thing. I need to return props, and one of those props is the access token. And my sort of idea was like, okay, let's also return like a default organization for Sentry because most people are only a member of one organization, which means we can infer the organization they're operating on. I'll explain that when I get to the tools. Generally speaking, straightforward, follow the guide. You're going to have no problems here. I will say, it's beta software. Keep an eye on updates. There's still a lot of work to be done. Like we have a number of issues, and I'll dive through them later. But otherwise, your implementation should roughly look probably pretty similar to this, right? And I'm using Hono here. I think you can use anything, but it's like Cloudflare Workers. Hono, I guess it's Hono technically. Hono works really well there. Anyways, so straightforward, right? That's it. That's the non-MCP components. Now, there is another wrapper, and so I'm going to talk about this. So I was trying to find a clean way to separate all this logic because what we have is we have an MCP server, we have some web stuff, and then we have Cloudflare-specific worker code, right? Some of what I showed you is like roughly Cloudflare-specific, sorry. And what I mean by like, this is for Cloudflare. Maybe it can work elsewhere. I don't know, probably, but it is for Cloudflare, right? This hypothetically can work elsewhere. It's just a Hono app, right? Anyways, I was trying to make a clean separation here. And so that starts with, I've got a server, right? Now, this is about all that you need to couple it to Cloudflare. And this, I was inspired by Neon, the database company, how they approached it. And what I wanted was self-documenting tools. And the problem Cloudflare has right now today is in this server, these props, sorry, I've abstracted this a little bit, so it's slightly more confusing. But these props right here get passed into the worker. The worker is this server the worker is roughly the server. It'll make sense in a second. So I've got this Cloudflare worker transport. The props get passed as this.props. This is a durable object. Again, I'm not going to explain it. I find it personally very confusing how these APIs kind of work. It implies a lot for you, and thus you must know exactly what it means. But this.server, this is our MCP server that we're binding. This is just the straight up package from the MCP SDK. And then this.props, which under the hood, MCP agent, which is Cloudflare's agents SDK, binds this.props for you. And again, it is this payload right here. Okay? So that's all you got to know is this.props comes from that props payload. And I've abstracted it through this configure server thing. And why I did that is because I want all of the tools defined And I don't want them explicitly referencing this.props, because otherwise what you do, and what you do in their example, is you'd be like server.tool, thing, description, if I can type, async, and you would be like this.props.foo, right? Oh, no. Here's a good example. You do this. The problem is all of a sudden you have now local context bound functions, which means you need access to this instance if you say wanted to get a list of all tools bound to the server, which you can't actually do today anyways because none of the methods are exposed. But I wanted to abstract that, so what I did is I wrote this little thing, kind of similar to how Neon did it, but all it does is wrap all the functions, and then it passes a new argument, which I've called server context, which is basically just props. It's separated from props because I have this other transport, which I'll talk about in a minute, but trust me, it makes sense. All this is doing is calling the same thing you'd call a tool, but it's passing in props right here, which, where's the tooltip? Okay, it's not really helpful, is it? Which just has access to the access token and organization slug, right? And then I'm doing one other thing where I'm just returning a string, and then I'm passing the string in here. This might be a bad idea. I can change it later. It's not a big deal. I also added a little bit of error handling in here just to make it cleaner. I've got a Sentry abstraction, etc. But generally speaking, all you need to know is I am wrapping Cloudflare's server, which is this thing, this.server, versus doing this.server.tool directly right here, okay? And that lets me reuse the server, which is really what I'm after in this whole thing. Sorry, let me undo that. Okay. I don't like the unsaved changes files. Okay. Tools, heavily inspired by Neon. This is like the fundamental thing that I was driven by. And what I mean by that is like, one thing I find frustrating in TypeScript and the JavaScript ecosystem is there's all these patterns you have to follow, or you should follow rather, to make it sort of a cleaner code base, which generally makes it easier to test, easier to develop against. And I'm always optimizing for like, if I don't touch this for 6 months, will it be easy for me to like add functionality to it, keep it stable, understand what's going on, etc. And so this is an abstraction to that. And it's two things, and it's not the cleanest it could be. And one of the reasons I would say that is true is because what I would want to do is define the MCP server. Like I'd like to do, oops, okay, come on. New MCP server. I would like to do this, server.tool, this thing, right? I would love for it to look like this and then be able to like get tools and then self-document from this get tools thing. Currently, however, these are not exposed via public API. I'm hoping they'll change that, but whatever. That's why it is the way it is today. We've got a name, a description. This is really important. These are all going to be fed into any capable agent. Now, it's not guaranteed that that's true, but it should be true. And so what I mean by that is this description needs to be optimized for the LLM. That also means it will change between different LLMs in terms of its ability to interpret it. So you got to consider that. They're mostly similar and they keep up with each other. So I don't think you have to over-optimize that much. But you just need to know this gets fed to an LLM. And so this is just my shitty way of breaking this up so it's a little bit easier to read. So we've got all these tools, right? And again, your goal with this is to provide abstractions, not just your JSON. Don't just expose your JSON API. Provide abstractions that make sense to a language model, which means that makes sense to you as a human, not to you as a machine. And the best way to reason about this is I could expose to you Swagger or something like that, or Scalar, with my open API spec, and it could auto hyperlink everything. And you could click around and use most products through the API, but you wouldn't do that because it makes no sense because you're a human and you know how to use user interfaces, not machine interfaces. This to me is the same thing. You're building an LLM interface that's optimized for that consumption model, that's optimized for this robot, not quite a human, doesn't need a user interface with colors and all this stuff because that doesn't actually help it, but does need language to be clarified in a bunch of cases. And so a lot of what you see in here don't take as science, take as a best guess, and I've not well vetted it. For example, use this tool when you need to do X and Y. Inspired by some prior art, may or may not make sense in a lot of cases, not well tested. But I'm trying to cater to the language model to understand what this is for and more specifically how a human would use it. And so I've got a bunch of things in here. It's got a name, a description, and a ZOD schema. Mostly straightforward, right? Like these should not be the hard things. This, I love TypeScript. I hate it. Was a pain in the ass. It's very similar to Neon's implementation. I tried to... MCP does a good job in their protocol of correctly doing types, and if you've ever worked with TypeScript, the more correct a type is, the more annoying it is to work with. And what I mean by that is they have function overrides and things like this, or overloading, which means the types get quite variable, and you can see that right here. I'm not going to explain this. Don't worry about it. Copy paste this if you want. Neon's is also open source. Ours is technically under RFSL, but this is not. It's not a big deal. This is not really IP. And then finally, I'm exporting tool handlers. And this is just a map of all those definitions above to the function. Pretty straightforward. You'll see we're instantiating the Sentry API, calling an endpoint, and then again, the output is designed for the LLM, most important thing. And so here's a really good example of what I mean is I've got this get errors detail function, which looks nothing like the API upstream. For example, one of the things you can pass in is a URL to the error, not just an ID or something, right? Sure, we could expose that on the REST API, but we don't. It grabs the latest event for an issue, and we're going to expand this to grab the issue as well. And then it dumps a pretty curated selection of information. And I will tell you, this is, 2% of the payload that's returned from this endpoint. There's a lot of other detail. Now, some of that could be useful, but there's a balancing act here. And then again, I try to do this thing where I'm like, let's return this information that hopefully helps it understand how to use this data in real world, okay? Same thing here, search errors in file. I'm like, okay, well, it's not going to be able to necessarily pass the correct parameter for file name that we need in Sentry to do a suffix-based search, but I can sort of suggest to it how it might do that. And I do that in the definition, but generally speaking, this is trying to find a bunch of errors that are in a specific file in the repository. You should be able to understand how that makes sense. Anyways, straightforward, right? Like, nothing complicated in here, just API endpoints returning this markdown response. Now, markdown might be the wrong answer to this thing. There's not specs for this kind of stuff. Again, it's whatever the LLM can interpret super well. Markdown seems to be like a safe bet for these things. But even here, I'm specifically returning the Sentry DSN, which is a second call. I have one tool, create project, and it's actually, this endpoint is doing 2 API calls. It's doing a project creation post, and it's doing a client keys post after that. And that's returning the project information and the client key it created. And I'm doing this because the example workflow here is, hey, I've got a new repository. I want to instrument Sentry in it, or I want to add Sentry to it. Well, that requires me to register the service in Sentry and then grab that DSN and then configure the local app. And we're going to expand this workflow quite drastically, actually. But that's how you should understand this. So straightforward, right? Just gets registered here. Done. That's all you need. And you could have less code than this if you were less hardcore than I am about trying to do self-documentation and all this other stuff, right? But it's really, really easy. And that was the OAuth proxy and everything you need. Cloudflare's guide will give you that. I want to go a little bit farther. So a second thing I needed, and this is mandatory for production services, is testability, right? I've got 2 things going on in this repo. I don't know if they're going to work, but I've got unit tests, which actually don't do anything. They're like, okay, I'm testing like literally just a random helper function, this extract issue ID function, and then I'm testing like, does the robot's endpoint render? It was basically just a dumb way for me to get a test suite up and running. Not useful, right? Not testing the MCP, not testing anything. Now, you'll learn all the data science people that are like, oh, we got evals and we got big cloud services to pay for all this stuff. I'm an engineer. I run CI. CI is just infrastructure. There's no data science to it. I need to know, does this do everything it used to do just as well, if not better? And the way I do that is via test. It's test-driven development, but we have new terms for it in the data science world. So I'm gonna ignore all those cloud services. What I wanted was a local test runner that would do, I forget what they call it, but that would basically say, hey, within the scope of using this in an LLM, when I'm prompted and use this tool, does it do what I expect it to do? And the way you do that is you make one call to the LLM with the tools, and then you make a second call to validate its output. I forget what the name is for this. You can look it up. You'll figure it out. I'll probably find it while I'm talking to you in this. To do that, I'm using a software called Evalite. I will tell you, or Evalite, there's no shade to people working on this, but it feels very brittle because it's overriding some stuff in Vitest, and that stuff is not good to override in the sense of like this is not compatible with the current version of Vitest, and I don't think this package is that old. So stop doing this kind of stuff, people, or make the ecosystem extensible. So, but what it's doing is it's giving me this eval test suite, and I'm just going to show you what that looks like. So I have it wired up to eval, right? And this is going to run some, they call them evals. It's not the same as a unit test, but you can think of it like, it's almost like BDD, which is behavior-driven, is that what we called it? I don't know. But there used to be a method of testing where you kind of describe what you want and it abstracts it. This is kind of similar. So I'm giving it this input to an LLM, and this actually all hit OpenAI. It did not hit Sentry because I've mocked it, and I'll talk about that in a minute. And this is the actual output it gave me from this prompt, right? And this is what I wanted. It's testing over here, a score. All I care is that the score is 100%. 100% of the time. That's my pass-fail rate, right? That's CI. That's testing. It's not data science of like, is this academically better or not? I make this academically better by expanding this test suite and ensuring every single one's at 100%. Is that the best way to do it? I don't know. I actually don't really care. Okay, so in here, I've got a couple complicated ones. So this one's like create a new team, but then it's actually trying to dictate the response just so I can test more cleanly on it. Even though this is a truthfulness test, and I'll show you what I mean by that, it's a little bit tricky to get this to be like correctly 100%. So that's all those are. It's using this package called Evalate, which looks like this. Okay? Looks kind of like the test, not quite. Now, the reason this is a problem is because I should be able to use this with JUnit test reporting, which is a standard because these are just tests. I don't think I can, and I don't think I can because it's overriding of a test, and so that ignores the compatibility issue. I should be able to use this with code coverage, so I can be like, oh, we actually forgot to test this one MCP tool that's available. We need to design an eval for that, right? Because there's some stuff that's untested right now in Sentry. But if you ignore that, this is the best thing I've found so far, and it's a pretty good design. It's just I'm worried about how well it's maintained based on the issue tracker, and I think it's one person working on it. I'm hoping it does, or somebody forks it and keeps going, because this is useful. I'm not going to buy a third-party vendor to have a test framework that requires their cloud to run when clearly I don't need their cloud to run. All I needed was an API token, right? Okay, so I got this just to show you. And this actually took a bunch of work. And again, the repo is public, so you can look at all this. I have a bunch of predefined stuff. I was a little bit inspired by Neon here, but they use one of these third-party cloud vendors, Braintrust, which, again, cloud service, I'm not paying for it. I've got a bunch of my inputs and the expected output. And then I've got this task, and the task is actually how it executes a test. This is the annoying thing. So standard IO, STD IO, Studio, whatever you want to call this thing, this is the old transport of MCP. Without going into everything, this thing right here is actually using standard IO. Command is standard IO. It's running something locally. It's not just communicating with this server, okay? So I had to also build this transport, which is why I abstracted MCP from Cloudflare workers the way I did. And it's why fundamentally this.props could not be bound in context there. It's also passing this mocks thing. And what I'm doing is I'm mocking all Sentry responses so we have predictability. And so I don't have to rely on extra network calls for no reason. But it's mostly the predictability concern. So I'm mocking all that. If you have opinions about why you shouldn't do that because it doesn't test the real world, you are fundamentally wrong, and this is how you should design independent services. You can add an extra layer of test if you're worried about the API changing or something, but like this is the way you should test these kinds of things. And then we're using Vercel's AI SDK here, and they've actually got a way to bundle the MCP client into tools, because MCP is just a set of remote tools versus local tools. So it's just a set of functions, right? That's the beautiful thing about this paradigm with agents. And then it's got a prompt here. That I don't know if you needed this or not. This was me just experimenting, not scientific. This sucks, but the API is a little wonky, to be honest with you. Maybe there's a better way, but I couldn't figure it out from the docs. But generally speaking, I'm just trying to get the resulting output from a chain of these calls, because when LLMs call tools, it's actually several calls back and forth, like several network hops, which means it's inefficient, which is one of the challenges we have to solve in this industry. So I'm consuming the stream of all those different chains of calls, and then I'm getting the resulting text, and that's my factuality score. Factuality score, I just took this from the docs of Evalate, is, or I guess it's from auto evals. I don't know, people have taken it from each other, which it looks like from his Braintrust. Okay, whatever. But this is basically just the thing that is trying to test if it's correct, right? Okay. One last thing, and I'm going to talk about all the problems we have to solve yet. So the standard IO transport, pretty straightforward. This is just provided by the SDK. Again, we're just configuring the server. We're passing in different contexts, and specifically, we actually can read the Sentry auth token from the environment, which actually means this MCP provider can do both. Again, Neon inspired this. I'm like, oh yeah, it's pretty easy to wrap this and do both of them at once because it provides all the fundamentals. But it does both. A standard IO transport, that the auth is bound, or the token is bound via the environment. And this is sort of Sentry's standard environment variable for that. Or the web protocol, which uses OAuth. And then again, I'm listening for mocks. And then when the mocks are present, I use the MSW thing, which is the HTTP mocking library, mock service workers, to actually mock these requests, right? And I'm just saying, if it's OpenAI, allow it through. You'd obviously have to change this to be Anthropic or any other model provider you have, or invert this and say, only for Sentry, mock the API requests. But I prefer to mock everything by default, just so there's not like stray network requests. Anyways, pretty straightforward. Then we just bind the context, same thing, that's just code. All right, I think that is the core of the code base. What's beautiful here is when I commit, when I open a pull request, it'll run unit tests, it'll run evals, it'll fail the build if the evals fail. And I can continue to iterate on that thing to keep reliability in production, right? TDD, very important. Or not, this isn't really TDD, but you get my point. Same thing, steal this from the repository if you want. It's mostly straightforward. It's doing what we know how to do elsewhere, which is how we should apply these principles. Okay, let's go to all the problems. If you want access to all the code, it's here. Again, it's under our fair source licensing schema, which is our FSL license. But if you're just taking like little things, it's fine. If you copy paste the entire repository into your own world and try to use it against Sentry, that's a little sketch. There's a lot of challenges. I've tried to check a bunch of issues, and this is, God damn it. Welcome to corporate auth. 1 second, let's go through auth 1, and then auth 2, and then auth 3. Oh, no, we can't do that one. Hang on, let's use this auth. Okay. This videos have to send to Cloudflare so they sort of understand some of the pain points, but there are a litany of like OAuth concerns. So we hit a bunch of bugs, and some of those bugs we didn't have logging to understand what's going on. They'll fix them all. This is like sub 2 weeks. Like everything's brand new here. But there was a lot going on in auth that kind of sucks. And what I mean by that is, if you remember in this, I'm grabbing this organization slug. And you can think of this as like, this is a session state. So I'm binding the default organization to the session state, but I'd like to be able to change that. Not only would I like to be able to change it, if there's more than one, I'd like the user to select it when they authenticate. That's really hard to do right now because you would need to inject a flow into this to let them select it, and that's a problem. And then separately, to be able to let them change it later, you would have a page on here or something that also OAuths in, logs them in so you can get their user ID, which is where all this state is bound in Cloudflare. And then you could give them a list of these clients, like these MCP clients, and give them the default organization. Anyways, suffice to say, there's some nice to haves or desirables in there, which is kind of under our improved OAuth flow. And then there's a couple things that are actually, a couple of these are kind of complicated in the sense of, where's it at? If you change the scopes required in the upstream auth provider, so say I need project right scope all of a sudden for my tools to exist. Unfortunately, the system right now does not prompt you to reauth. It doesn't sort of figure out that like, oh, I need new scopes. You don't have those scopes. I need to upgrade your authentication. Probably reasonable to fix. They just need to store scopes and then check the current scopes or give a hook to reauth. Note to self, open the ticket on the OAuth provider. There is also a big issue. So these bugs are kind of what we consider really we need them for prod to be stable. When I was first writing this in the server, sorry, I broke something here. I forget what, something stupid. I think I was passing a Zod schema here instead of an object, and it just errored out. And I did not get any of the errors. And I did not get any of the errors because this is inside of Cloudflare's abstraction or something like that. Anyways, that was a problem. I need the errors. So this is just tracking. We need better instrumentation. And this is a mistake we make a lot in the industry is production services cannot exist unless they can be observed, like logged, metrics, traces, whatever it is to observe it. You need that. And fundamentally, this is not just guy who made error monitoring a thing. I need error handling in every single thing of all time in production. I need those errors to go into Sentry. If it doesn't, if I do not have errors from your framework in Sentry, it is not production ready. Period. It's as simple as that. And so that's kind of what that's covering. Beyond that, these are just kind of our ideas for like, oh, what are other workflows, we can provide? Like, oh, so we have this root cause analysis and autofix behavior. We're like, oh, it'd be good to expose that behavior inside of MCP. Or what if I could say like, just query Sentry and be like, hey, where are the bottlenecks in my application? And it could give me some ideas. And then within the context of my editor, I can figure those out. And so some of those are like the things that are quite interesting to us. But otherwise, it's like, this is pretty straightforward, I'd say. And then like, I just deployed this to Cloudflare Workers. I don't know how much money it's costing me, but it's something like $5. I don't really care. It's Sentry's bill. That's a tiny bill. Not a big deal for us. But I think there is still a lot of opportunity to simplify the APIs. Like what I want to see is this whole abstraction die and become formal. Like I don't want to have to do this override here because I'm still, like what I would tell you is the performance engineer in me, this is lazy eval, which can be good sometimes, but this is lazy eval where I'm going to do it no matter what, which means I would prefer to do it up here. I'd prefer to have the server be always configured and then the handlers to be able to accept context. And what I mean by that is these handlers, see, I have this context behavior. This is my own implementation. There's actually a function called, or this extra thing here, which I don't know what it's used for, but what I would have preferred is to have been able to inject organization slug and access token in that extra behavior, because that extra attribute, rather, is already available on the MCP TypeScript provider. And then Cloudflare's worker should just inject into that. So I have a clean path for just a vanilla MCP server that then gets bound inside of the Cloudflare worker, right? That's the main complaint, honestly. Everything else is like, I have no idea how Cloudflare works, or JavaScript is just my enemy. I hope this is useful. If you have ideas, open them up on the repo. If you have ideas for like how we can leverage this in Sentry, if you have feedback, if something fucking breaks, feel free to tweet at me if you have questions. Cloudflare is super responsive to feedback, by the way, so you can also like send some stuff to them. I think their paradigm is really good, and Sentry is going to build some really fucking great first-class monitoring around all this, because again, there's nothing that's changed about software in this. So it's like, I still need tests, I still need errors, I still need traces, and then there's also some data science-y qualitative monitoring type stuff that I don't care about, but some people do, right? And so we're going to really make sure we have a honed-in way to monitor all this and to make sure you can really react to things just like everything else. But with that said, I will call it there, and it's a 35-minute video. Peace.